talked a lot about the science, and we've been doing some more of these science treks to get a little deeper into the science part. And I think it's interesting. Again, I don't expect that everybody's going to remember everything, but I think the more you're exposed to this stuff, the more it sinks in, the more holes in the Swiss cheese that we like to call our brain get filled in with useful information. So, it kind of helps build skills there. So, we are tonight we're going to look at metaphor, take a little look at that, at contested frames, and how morality and moral categories kind of explain a lot of what's going on. And so let me start with metaphor, because metaphor is kind of cool. And so George Lakoff and Mark Johnson really dug into this quite a while ago. And they find metaphor being absolutely central to human thinking, which is a real revolution in psychology. And when they came out with this, it really was very controversial, and it seems to have been fairly well accepted now. But the definition is the essence of metaphor is understanding and experiencing one kind of thing in terms of another. And the weird thing is we're constantly doing this, and it comes so totally naturally, and it's so deeply embedded in our language and our culture that we don't even notice when we're using metaphors. Lakoff and his buddy Mark Johnson, here they are. I think it's nice to see the people who do this. Lakoff, again, known mainly for his work on framing, but this work on metaphors is really pretty groundbreaking stuff, another part of his long career. And they were exploring new territory in the fields of linguistics and philosophy. And they found that metaphor, rather than being just a tool to spice up your writing and your speaking, turns out that it's instead absolutely central to humans' understanding of the world. And it actually structures our language and our behavior, which is kind of amazing. The book is Metaphors We Live By, and they make a pretty convincing argument that human thought processes are largely metaphorical. And there are lots of everyday examples. Let me show you one here. Time is money. We hear this as a slogan, but think about how we talk about time. You're wasting my time, like you're wasting money. This gadget will save you hours. I don't have the time to give you. So you have something of value that you're not giving to somebody. How do you spend your time? A flat tire cost me an hour. I've invested a lot of time. All of these words, time to spare, running out of time, budgeting, all these other things are words that are inside this metaphor of time is money, and I never really thought of it before, but that is the way we talk about time. One very powerful metaphor that our brain uses is that it's something of value to us, and so we use the money metaphor, which is the closest thing we have to explaining value. And so that I thought was a real interesting example. Let me give you some other everyday examples. And the interesting part about these examples, and a central part of Lakoff and Johnson's theory, is that many of the metaphors we use refer to the body and things in relation to it. So, for example, up north. I mean, up is a direction we experience. We say up north. Downtown. Giving it away. It's away from our bodies. The left and the right political spectrum. Happy is up, sad is down. Get up. Oh, I didn't bold that. He fell asleep, another bodily thing. On top of it or control over it. So again, your body in relation to things in the world around it. And in this book and in some other another book called Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things, he just goes into it in like super depth. And it's absolutely astounding how many of the ways we think and the words we use all revolve so much around this connection to bodily, to where our bodies are in space and how things relate to it. Let's go a little deeper into one of these, and that is the metaphor of argument as war. And I kind of, I think all of us have thought of this at one time or another, but it really is how we conduct arguments. And there's something really interesting about this that I'll tell you in a minute. But think about this: argument is war. Your claims are indefensible. He attacked every weak point in my argument. His criticisms were right on target. I demolished his argument. I've never won an argument with him. You disagree? You disagree? Okay, shoot. If he used that strategy, he'll wipe you out. And he shot down all of my arguments. And that's pretty amazing. And of course, objectively, arguments are not wars, and wars are not arguments. But the way we conduct an argument is often based solidly in the concept of war. Lakoff and Johnson say that argument is partially structured, understood, performed, and talked about in terms of war. The concept is metaphorically structured. The activity is metaphorically structured, and consequently, the language is metaphorically structured. What amazes me about that is that this changes our behavior, not only what we speak, but how we do things, how we approach an argument in our thoughts and in our actions. The other kind of surprising thing, which maybe not so surprising because we've talked about frames as stories that constrain the argument, they go on to say that argument is a war, that the argument is war metaphor often prevents us from thinking or speaking about the positive aspects of argumentation. And those are exploration, cooperation, careful consideration of the other side, openness to new ideas. I know in philosophy and logic and rhetoric and science, argument is not necessarily an indication of violent confrontation. It's more, this is a process we go through. So I think that's also amazing that, again, some of the metaphors we use to get by during the day that are so ingrained in us that we don't even know it help us to understand what's going on, but also can keep us from understanding important things. Once you're aware of this, it gets easier to break out of it. Any questions on that or comments? It's kind of a wacky idea. Tom, did you raise your hand, or are you just playing with your mouse?
I was going to make a comment. Yeah, when you talked about the the time is money thing, I can relate back to being at work. And I mean, we would have meetings and think about how much money is being spent here. We're wasting, if you have people, if you have an hour meeting, you make $100 an hour, and there's 10 people in the room, it's it's a lot of money that goes up the tree or goes out, whatever. And
out the window, out
the window, yes. And it doesn't, you may not get anything for it. So
yeah.
But anyway, that came to mind when you brought that up. And I think this argument about argument is war, I think that's really true. I mean, it's not an argument anymore. It's us against them, or me against him, or whatever it is.
Yeah. And Carrie, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to comment that, a few years back, I wrote some kids' books, and one of them on language and how a lot of what we say doesn't make sense, and to open the conversation for maybe like a second grade age group. But just in bringing back the verses, when we talk about back on top, come from behind, saying those, like, what does that mean to a little one? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Back on top, come from behind, like the race. What else did I say? Talking about like big and small and how that had connotation too. And then I remember closing it with, it's the little that is you and the little that is me that makes the great big story that is we. Okay. It was we. Yeah. And I just think it would be really cool to start talking to little children about this in basic ways now, to help us decades down the road unpack what everyone's hearing in our culture.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think, it's amazing how sometimes when you think of how we speak to children, we actually, in a lot of ways, are both clear and more opaque, but the kids don't let us be too opaque because they just keep asking us and probing us until we finally explain it in a way that they can understand. It's kind of like, I talk about toddler logic. Just keep asking why all the time, and that gets down to things. Or like Joe Biden says, come back to me when you can say this to me like you'd be saying it to your grandma. you know. But I think it's fascinating. And the weird thing is, after I read the book, and maybe after tonight, as you think about just tomorrow, think about the words you're using during the day. As you're speaking, I'm trying to step out, go meta. And I think you'll be shocked at just how many times we use metaphors in our everyday thinking and words that don't. I mean, I would hate to be a non-English speaker trying to learn English. I have a hard enough time I'm trying to learn French. It's not going well.
Well, I'm sure other languages have their own use of metaphor and
I'm
things
sure,
like
but
that.
I think it's fairly well known that English is just rife with all sorts of terms and such that are just not as prevalent in other cultures. But
So,
That's one of the
Nancy,
things in higher ed, in my training in higher ed, where we'd have conferences and they'd have a workshop on this and say, we have, second language learners and you have to watch how you speak because not everyone will understand the context, and use that as an illustration and to a point central to your lesson. That's, imagine the inequity,
yeah.
it was fun and cool to actually dive into that.
Central to your lesson. Again, something. I mean, isn't it amazing? It's everywhere. Start looking at it. It's like the red Volvo. Like when you buy a red Volvo, you're just shocked at how many red Volvos there are on the road. All of a sudden, they all just popped up, which, of course, they didn't. And if anyone who's owned a Volvo knows that you keep Volvos because they cost so much to fix, the sunk cost fallacy gets involved, and you just can't bear to sell the things because you have so much invested in them.
so Nancy has a question.
Nancy. Hi, Nancy.
Hi.
Again.
I just, similar to what Carrie was talking about, I was thinking about how gendered our metaphors are, and like argument is war, and so many things, sports and business, and as there's so much of this that's gendered, and that we, there's all sorts of things, places you could go with that, but even just politically, that we might want to not try to not use metaphors that people don't relate to, whether it's children or
Yep.
cultural ones or gender-based ones or whatever.
And
That's true.
and what's kind of interesting, even in a meta way, about the meta conversation we're already having, is if we use metaphor this much, and this naturally happened that naturally became part of our culture, that metaphor is so central and is so much a part of it, then it tells us that in our messaging, the more metaphors we can use, the better off we're going to be.
Well,
Doesn't
but I
that
think what
seem to make
Nancy was
sense?
trying to say is you got to be careful too about the metaphors you use.
Yes,
And-
yeah, absolutely, yes.
And when I worked for St. Louis Park Public Schools, sometimes we just say things, and I can't think of anything off the top of my head. But when we were in our cabinet meetings, we would talk about like what is the origin of that saying, and a lot of times it has some pretty significant racial overtones and things like that. And we're like, oh my gosh, we have to stop saying that. And then trying to not say it is very difficult because it's so much a part of how we talk. So you do have to be careful about what metaphors you're using and what implications those might have too for other cultures.
Yeah, that's why this is an advanced session here.
And try to use metaphors that might be more relatable to the people you're targeting with the
Mhm.
Yeah.
message.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And one metaphor may work with this person, but it was not going to work with somebody else. You have to approach them where they're from, and sometimes that's hard to know. And
Oh, George, I was thinking too, as we're talking about this, there's a lot of sports metaphors that we all use,
yeah,
and there's a ton of them. I mean, you think like hitting a home run or making it to first base, or you name it, there's just all kinds of them. Um, you know, so
Yeah, keep a look on that. Check that out, and maybe in the next one of these, we'll just kind of just take a minute to see what people notice. But like I said, I think you'll start noticing this a lot more, and it's really amazing. Lakoff's book on it, the Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things, it's really for people who want to get deep in it. It's a lot of examples. It's not an easy reading book. I consider it worth the time, but it put me to sleep a number of times. So
Oh, and if it put George to sleep,
If it
oh
put
my,
me to
yeah, he
sleep.
could read. He reads like the founding fathers in the original language of the
Of
old English
English,
with the S that looks like an F, and so-
I'm a nerd. It should be obvious. If it's not, it is now. So okay, well, is there anything else on that? And if not, I'll go on to the next thing. All right, here we go. I'm going to go back to this. Yeah, and if you're in speaker view, it's easier to read these. Just another mention of that. So I call this When Words Collide, or contested frames. We're on to a different topic now. Liberals and conservatives both use words like fairness and security.
And did you mean to advance your slide?
I did mean to advance my slide, I think. What's my next one? No, I not yet.
Okay.
I could just go back to me.
It's kind of confusing.
Anyway, liberals and conservatives both use words like fairness or security, responsibility and freedom. However, they mean different things to each group. And we can and must take back some of these words. Of course, the key is in trying to figure out which ones are worth taking back and which ones aren't. Sometimes conservatives have grabbed words and they're so identified with them, or they've been so successful at tying it to an issue that the mere mention of those words sets off all the conservative frames. But there are some really worth taking back. Here's a quote from Lakoff: "A major goal of political framing is to get your version of contested concepts accepted by the voters. Messaging can then use these concepts and their language, messaging can then use these concepts and their language freely and effectively." And I'll tell you that if you do want to learn more about this, it is the technical term in the psych literature is essentially contested concepts. Took me a while to find the write-ups on this because I just Googled contested concepts. Oddly enough, not much came up. I saw somebody mention essentially, and I added that in, and boom, there was a bunch of stuff. Of course, it's nerdy dry reading that I like to do. But anyway, so within our worldviews, liberals and conservatives have different sets of core values. We talk about this in the workshop. You think all of you guys have been there. And liberals center on empathy and responsibility for oneself and the community, which is extended out from the neighborhood to the world. Conservatives center on individual responsibility and the liberty to act without interference. The difference between this is these are in the choice of the values we apply to the policies, or said another way, our policies that we champion are directly derived from the values that we prioritize in our worldview. But there are those that are contested. And for example, this next one here, these are some examples. Justice. On the right, justice may be retribution, the death penalty. They're in favor of the death penalty, many of them, not all of them. Or is it rehabilitation? We're looking at, starting from empathy, we're looking at justice as well, not only in dealing with people who have been convicted of a crime, where we feel that it's important that this person is redeemable and we do something about it, but also justice in making sure that people who shouldn't be going to jail don't, and that people are treated with respect if they are arrested or otherwise have dealings with authority. Fairness is another one. On the right, they see that it's unfair to take money from hardworking people and give it to lazy people. We kind of don't see it that way. We see fairness as, well, if somebody's in trouble, let's give them a hand up. That's fair. Equality is another word that is looked at differently. On the right, everyone's equally free to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. Basically the equality of opportunity on the right. And not necessarily that's equality of outcomes on our side, but we do think everyone has the same rights and responsibilities. So, there's no reason why anyone should be treated differently, unless we're talking equity, which is another thing. And the reasons why equity is important is that not everybody starts out at the same place on the starting line. Another metaphor should have a little thing that pops up and goes, metaphor. Maybe I need a mascot, like an animal that pops up and says stuff. Anyway, Lisa says, move on, George. She doesn't even have to say it, and I can hear it. Okay. So, and then these other ones, authority. Well, basically, who's the authority? And what respect do you give that authority? Some people believe that because authority exists, you should therefore abide by it all the time and never question it. That's a very common thing on the right. On the left, a lot of us teach our kids to question authority, which is kind of important. And then different things are sacred to each side. I'll leave you to think about that and the things that are sacred to us. And that's an interesting idea. And then caring is another one. And then we go to freedom, and we'll take a little closer look at freedom. And conservatives' idea of freedom is based in individual freedom to do what they choose, but also in great measure freedom from things like government, laws, and regulations which they feel oppress them. Democrats, of course, are the enemy in this model, and we're an elite that want to dominate individuals. And what happened to my? Sorry, something happened here. Well, okay, I lost some of the conservative ideas on freedom. Well, we kind of got an idea there, and we mentioned some of them. I don't really need to go into a whole lot more. Liberals also express freedom and more positively, I think, is the freedom to, for example, marry who you love, freedom to vote, freedom of religious belief, both theistic and non-theistic, freedom from racism, freedom from predatory pharma. Sorry, let me pop these up. For example, predatory pharma, having that is are you really free if you have a disease that could be fatal? And Martin Shkreli or all of his buddies at Pfizer and Moderna, Abbott, all these other folks, show up and go, yeah, we can solve that. We can cure you of that. It's just going to be $10,000 a pill or $30,000 a pill. We would need freedom from things like that. And then freedom from the begging model of healthcare. You might be fortunate enough to have healthcare, but if you don't, or you have a high deductible policy, well, what happens when you get sick? Your friends go to a bar and they have a big giant fundraiser for you, or they launch a GoFundMe page. What a stupid way to do healthcare. Sorry, I'm not here to editorialize. So we need to, though, express our values and our policy positions in terms of freedom. And I don't know that we always do that. It's certainly not something that's top of mind. So when we're making a message, consider using freedom as a moral value to base your messages in. Because again, all the messages we have can be expressed with almost all of the values we hold. So when we express a specific message on an issue, we're not only showing why we care about that issue, but we're actually bolstering the concept that we care at all and the value that's behind that. And so, we can do that. You can go the same way. You can take a value and find that it applies across all issues, but you can also take an issue and find that you can derive messages from those that value. So don't be afraid to use a contested frame. And talk about how someone is more free when our policy goals are realized if we're using freedom. But again, don't be afraid to do that. Look at that at the value and say, is that something we also value, or is it something that we've been avoiding? I mean, people see the American flag as something that belongs to the conservatives. How the heck did that happen? I don't see any reason why we don't have the American flag all over the place, because we're the ones who are actually upholding those values, and also the government that it created, the power that it gave us as people. The other side is going completely off the rails on making sure that we do not have democracy. They're eroding it little bit by little bit by little bit, so that something like legislating the right of the legislature to throw out the people's vote and just choose who they want to win in a presidential election. That would have been completely unthinkable for virtually all of our history until today. Their incrementalism brings them to be able to do these very weird things. Also, don't or do be afraid of using dog whistles and core conservative frames. Okay, because there are things that we should not be using. One example right now is in the education field and with school boards, CRT. So, I don't know if you read Lisa's blog, but it's excellent. And she went in and researched it, found a good New York Times article on
New Yorker.
or New Yorker article on this. And it turns out that, as I suspected, because CRT was a pretty obscure legal theory, and it may have come into educational circles for people to look at and such, but we're not holding classes in K-12 on CRT. This is a in-depth, fairly obscure theory. It's just one of many things that inform curricula. But what happened is some guy, and it's always a guy for some reason, came up with this and said, this is better than the terms we're using to try to get school boards to teach our religious beliefs. What we do is we need an enemy, and CRT is perfect because critical, well, that's the word has some negative connotations. In this usage, it doesn't. It means something else. But of course, to most people, critical means, well, that's bad. And then race, of course, is what Republicans use all the time in order to divide us, and so that's a dog whistle. And then theory, of course, their whole thing is always that, well, theories are just theories. I mean, as if they don't have any reality at all, or they're tentative and not decided yet. And the theory of evolution is the most replicated, understood, and proven theory in all of science, including physical sciences, because there have been just that many more experiments and findings and research and people going around the globe studying some fish in a cave or whatever it is than have been done on the physics areas. So, anyway, there's that usage of it. So, are there any questions on that idea, on contested frames? Just kind of throwing these psychological concepts at you here, but okay. Well, we can go on because the next one is I'm sure will generate some questions. And another thing to think about is morality and moral categories. So in the workshops, we talk about this in our worldviews section that explains what liberals believe and what conservatives believe and how that informs the policies that we champion. And of course, as I said before, all politics is moral. And all this means is that politics is about right and wrong. And anyone can have a conversation about right and wrong. If you put it in those terms, you're probably going to have at least a substantive, if not a pleasant, conversation. And of course, whenever you're stuck and you really don't know what to say to a voter, you can always revert to right and wrong on an issue, and that'll start a conversation. But Lakoff also talks about moral categories, and I think I found this in his moral, in this book, Moral Politics, which might be backwards for you. But this is his major tome on this whole thing about strict father, nurturing parent, and all that stuff. It's, again, if you are a nerd like me, this one is much easier to read than the last one I told you about. It's still pretty thick. And in here, he builds on that worldview ideas by going a little bit farther. And he says that there are moral categories. And in the moral categories, you find that the different worldviews define who the moral citizens are and who the demons are. And I find this concept that shows up often in political talk to be also be fascinating, which is the idea of the victim and the villain and the hero. And this is a recurring theme. This is similar to that. So let's take a look here at the conservative model citizens. In the conservative worldview, I think I have this on a slide, the model conservative citizen is one that has conservative values, is self-disciplined and self-reliant, who upholds the morality of reward and punishment, and works to protect moral citizens, and acts in support of the moral order. And that moral order has a lot to do with the hierarchy that we don't necessarily have in our worldview, but is absolutely central to the Republic or the conservative worldview. And I'll point out that it's hard when I talk about Republicans and conservatives because the Republican Party is not the traditional conservative party it was. Many of those people have been thrown out and been replaced with people who, I don't know where they're coming from. They don't know where they're coming from. They live to own us, to own the libs. So, but that's who they consider to be oh, here, I can do that. Look at that. Is a model conservative citizen. You could add to this that a model conservative citizen is someone who also ensures that the concept of conservatism is taught to the next generation, and so that the worldview is preserved. They have a very strong need for that, and we apparently don't. I don't get that part. Then there are the model conservative demons. Those are people who are against conservative values, people who lack self-discipline. They're protectors of the public good, which to conservatives mean that if you're talking about the public good, it means you're trying to do things for people who don't deserve things being done for them. This was interesting. Oppose the way the military and criminal justice systems operate. This goes back to authority. The fact that things are the way they are means that we need to respect that. Of course, the way the things are the way they are is because mostly conservatives, some Democrats, have made a military action. I mean, a lot of Democrats supported, in fact, I think all but Paul Wellstone supported going to war with Iraq. And conservatives and some liberals have created a criminal justice system that spawned the concept of critical race theory to say, well, maybe our criminal justice system is prejudiced and stacked against people of color. And then demons are the advocates of equal rights, because they see our notions on equal rights as not respecting the hierarchy. Some people are naturally better than others in their worldview. So if you make everyone equal, well, obviously Bill Gates is not equal with the guy flipping burgers at McDonald's. Then again, the guy flipping burgers at McDonald's may not have had quite the same life experiences and advantages that Bill Gates have. So, we see it differently. So that's the way, this is an interesting way to look at the two worldviews. If we go to the modern or model liberal citizen, they're empathetic. They help the disadvantaged, protect those who need protection, promote and exemplifies fulfillment in life, which is a big one that we don't talk about very much. But, there's one of the great rights we have as citizens in a democracy to determine our own future is that we're not only free to just do things like build roads that we need and educate children, which needs to be done, we're also perfectly free to find ways to live fulfilled lives. And so we think it's fine to just say, let's support art and science and basic research and other things which may not necessarily save somebody's life or make somebody a buck, but they're things that make life better. And then, and the last one is a person who takes care of him or herself I'm using Lakoff's words here. This was before, I guess, he as a linguist understood that you should be a little more neutral on that. Anyway, takes care of themselves so that they can do all of this stuff and be fulfilled and the rest. And I think that's a really interesting concept. It really gets down to not only the power to determine what happens to us, it's the power that we have to determine how our lives are going to be best lived. I think it's a very hopeful way of looking at things, and I think if we can find ways to put that more in our messaging, I think that will help out. I'll read a part here where Lakoff talks about, he gives as an examples, model citizens on the conservative side have succeeded through hard work, have earned whatever they have through their own self-discipline. They deserve to keep what they have earned. Through their success and wealth, they create jobs which they give to other citizens. Simply by investing their money to maximize their earnings, they become philanthropists who give jobs to others and thereby create wealth for others. And aside from the editor here, yeah, show me when that's happened. I mean, obviously capitalism has brought us some great things, but also in general, certainly in the last 50 years, wealth has done this and wages have remained flat. So trickle down has never really worked as a way to generate wealth for people. Part of the myth is that these model citizens have been given nothing by the government and have made it all on their own. The American dream is that any honest, self-disciplined, hardworking person can do the same. These model citizens are seen by conservatives as the ideal Americans in the American dream. This is the last part I've been reading from Lakoff's stuff. And then, and this is dated a little bit, but he says the example of the demon of all demons for conservatives is, not surprisingly, Hillary Clinton. Again, quoting Lakoff, she's an uppity woman. I don't know that was a great choice of words. And a former, and that which opposes the moral order. She's a former anti-war activist who is pro-choice, which is the category 4 he calls, which is military and criminal justice systems. A protector of the public good, which gets back to empathy and such. Someone who gained her influence not on her own but through her husband. And a supporter of which goes against the hierarchy. And someone who gained her and a supporter of multiculturalism, which is the category 1 demon, which he calls those who are against conservative values. And so I don't, and again, this is dated, but it gives you an idea of what they're talking about. On the liberal side, Lakoff, this is really strange. Lakoff said, interestingly, there does not seem to be any identifiable type in American life that is a model citizen of all of the liberal model citizens. Oh, and I didn't get to the demons. Let's get to the demons, and then I'll give you an example of that. The modern liberal demon is the mean-spirited, selfish, and unfair who ignores, harms, or exploits the disadvantaged. People who hurt the environment. They're against public support of education, art, and scholarship. And they're against health care for the general public. These are people who fall into the demon category for liberals. And Lakoff says there is, of course, as rich a liberal demonology as there is a conservative one. And those who violate the categories are, of course, monsters of society. And let's see, the example, again dated, if there is a demon of all demons for liberals, it's Newt Gingrich. And so, which I think back, if anybody remembers, I think all of us remember Newt Gingrich. And the guy he's basically the enemy of everything we are. And he's the guy who said, basically, to all of the people in the House at the time and the freshmen that came in, we basically put a stop to things. You are not going to be friends with the liberals. You're not going to get to know their families. You're not going to go to dinner with them. We're cutting them off. You're not going to compromise with them. Everything they want to do, even it was our idea to begin with, These are things we are going to be against. And Mitch McConnell is the absolute embodiment of that in human form, assuming he is human. I don't know. I saw that picture of him a while back. What was the deal? His arm was all black. It was like, oh, his inner evil is showing. But again, I editorialize. So anyway, the Lakoff is a big one on making sure his theories and his concepts here actually are verifiable in the real world, that they explain things in the real world. And he says the theory explains why we have the categories of moral actions that we have, why we have the model citizens we have, and why we have the demons we have. The categories for moral actions arise from the metaphors in the moral system. The model citizens and demons arise from the categories of moral actions. There's a lot to unpack there, but that's basically where he's coming from. And it's kind of why I like Lakoff. I mean, there's I've met some people, not some people, I've met one guy who fiercely argued with me about Lakoff and saying, why are you teaching that? These things have been hotly debated, and Lakoff's been largely debunked, which is not true. I've looked for that. There are people like Steven Pinker and others who have written critical articles, but in almost every one of them, there's a flawed initial assumption, and which is kind of weird. But I think it's important. And my feeling on using Lakoff as the base theory to teach is that it is comprehensive. It explains how everything works, and it's comprehensible. And so I think that's important.
We have two questions.
We have two questions, and we're at 7:52, and I'm done with my part of the program. And so let's go to those questions.
So, Ron?
Thank you. I just have a comment. You're talking about Hillary as only one example of another issue we face, which is, she's, I think, the poster child of the accomplished, confident, and completely unafraid woman, working woman,
Mm-hmm.
which I think it was said, she needed to be baking cookies and making curtains.
Yep. The
So
hierarchy.
that entire school of thought of, completely discounting her or really any strong, accomplished woman of the same stature.
Yeah.
And what's interesting to me is, and George said it when he was talking about it, but that that on the conservative side, tell me if I'm wrong, if I misunderstood this, that they see her as getting to her position through her husband. And I would say her husband got to where he was because of her.
But again, just on that, it's that moral hierarchy thing that, God above man, man above nature, man above woman, and it goes down, rich above poor, and all this. That whole hierarchy works for them and is very important to them. And so you can see that the man above woman thing is huge on the conservative side. And they like to find examples where they can show, well, we're not against women because we have women in our party who are elected. Or we have black people too. There's that one. But the whole deal is they're not in charge. Who did they send to fool everybody? And who did they fool and trick into telling people a bunch of lies about Iraq? Colin Powell. You didn't see Dick Cheney go up in front of Congress and UN and present a bunch of bogus evidence. Those guys said, well, let's send Colin Powell out. Well, they didn't take the hit for it. Tom.
Yeah. So I was going to make the comment that you had mentioned about the liberal, or excuse me, the conservative and how they're self-made and all this other stuff. The problem is they end up using all the resources we have paid for to get to that point, and they don't look at it that way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we pay taxes to build roads, to build infrastructure that they freely use and don't pay their fair share for when they're, making their millions of dollars. And I think that's one of the things that, if you were able to point that out in a frame to conservatives saying, well, yeah, these self-made people are great, but they're standing on our shoulders.
Absolutely. And the shoulders of people long before us.
Yes,
Were able
exactly.
to, the thinking that we have and the research and the science that we have. And
And well, especially when you back in time and you look at the way they talked about the people that, as being mudsills, right? The foundation that these rich people were able to build their fortunes with.
yep. I wonder sometimes as an explanation is to use or not really a metaphor in this case, but pose the option just as a thought experiment to say, okay, you got where you got on your own. We're sending you an invoice. On that invoice, we're going to line item out what you need to pay. This isn't taxes. This is a bill for the entire cost of the education of every one of your employees, the cost of your percentage of the roads and bridges that have been built and used to move your goods, and on and on. The cost of the basic research that enabled you to produce the products that you have. Going back as far as we need to make sure that we covered your research, and just say this is, you didn't get here on your own. And Obama, the best one on this was Elizabeth Warren. She said it right. You didn't get here all by yourself. People helped you. And unfortunately, Obama flubbed the thing, and he wasn't usually doing this. For the most part, Obama was pretty good at framing issues and not stepping on his toes and tripping. But in this one, he goes, you didn't build that. And then, you have this factory, you didn't build that. Well, of course, that didn't go over. People are going, what are you talking about? And he just missed the whole on your own part and connecting it, which he did eventually do in that speech, connected it to, there are things that we invest in. And natural resource, Ron notes, don't forget resources and utilities.
Yeah, the resources are definitely belong to all of us. And yet, the federal government hands out leases to people to use those resources and gather them. Anyway, that gets into a whole nother topic.
Carrie? Yeah, that is another topic.
Just to Tom's point, I was watching the slides come up, I was blowing holes in everything, like we could frame it like this, we could neutralize and say, well, war is really about protecting people. And you know what I mean? Like we could, instead of like, we're going to blow them all up and kill those horrible people, reframe all of these things as like the nurturing protector. And we just have so much good work that we could do, at framing and taking back the language that really is ours as well. So that's all.
Yeah. No, that's really what this is all about. Because the more we learn, the more we are exposed to this stuff. That's why I think these Monday night things, I hope they're of value to people, and at least, going over it and over it so that we get in our heads how it works and we notice it. And if we're noticing it, then all of a sudden, I think we're going to be better messengers. And I think people around us will see this too. I mean, everybody here, I think, has been here before, and we've learned enough now that I think as we go out in our particular groups, either political or activist groups or whatever, that we're starting to explain to people that, you hear the way I'm talking about this and all that. This is something we can all learn. Let's learn this together and figure it out. ConnectionsLab.org